My name is Charlotte Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and the day my father was buried was the day my mother tried to erase me. I didn't expect comfort at his funeral. I didn't expect kindness. Grief has a way of making people awkward and distant. But I never imagined that while my father's coffin was still resting above the open ground, my own mother would stand beside it and announce to a crowd of relatives, business partners, and attorneys that I was adopted, and therefore had no right to inherit a single dollar of his estate. The cemetery was quiet except for the wind. My father had built Bennett Development Group from a single rental property into one of the most respected real estate firms in the state. People came from everywhere to pay their respects. Investors in tailored suits, employees with red eyes, distant cousins who hadn't called in years. And then there was my mother. Margaret Bennett stood in black silk, perfectly composed, not broken, not devastated, composed. The pastor had barely finished speaking when she stepped forward and cleared her throat. "I believe," she said, her voice steady, "that certain misunderstandings about my husband's estate need to be addressed before rumors begin." I remember thinking how strange that sounded at a funeral. She turned toward me, not gently, not sadly, but with something cold behind her eyes. "Charlotte," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "was adopted as an infant. She is not Richard's biological child, and as such, she will not be inheriting controlling interest in his estate." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. A murmur rippled through the crowd. My father's business partner, Daniel, stared at me in confusion. My aunt covered her mouth. Even the funeral director froze. I felt like the ground had tilted beneath my feet. Adopted. The word echoed in my head like a foreign language. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Margaret continued, pulling a cream-colored folder from her handbag with deliberate calm. "The paperwork is sealed, of course, but the legal documentation exists. Richard and I agreed to keep it private." She said it so smoothly, so confidently, as if she had rehearsed it, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. My entire childhood flashed through my mind in fragments. My father teaching me how to ride a bike, his hand steady on the seat. The nights we stayed late at his office when I was in college, reviewing contracts. The way he used to introduce me at company events. "This is my daughter. She's the future of this firm." None of it made sense. If this were true, how had I never known? Why would he never tell me? Why would he let me believe? No, something inside me shifted. Margaret wasn't crying. She wasn't grieving. She was positioning herself. I noticed Daniel step closer to her, whispering something urgent. She shook her head and raised her chin. "The estate," she continued, "will remain under my control as his lawful spouse. That is the appropriate legal outcome." That was when I understood. This wasn't an emotional confession. This was a strategic announcement. My father's will had not yet been publicly read, but everyone in that cemetery knew I had worked beside him for 12 years. Everyone knew he had gradually transferred operational authority to me. If I were suddenly not biological, the narrative would shift. Control would consolidate in her hands, and it was happening right here, in front of his grave. The humiliation burned, but something else burned hotter. Clarity. I stepped forward, my heels sinking slightly into the damp grass. "You're saying," I managed evenly, though my throat felt raw, "that I was legally adopted?" Margaret's lips curved into something that almost resembled sympathy. "Yes, Charlotte. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Gasps, whispering, eyes on me. I looked at the folder she held. She didn't offer to let me see it. She didn't show it to anyone. She simply held it like a prop. And suddenly, I noticed something else. If this had been true, why announce it now? Why not years ago? Why not during estate planning meetings I personally attended? Why wait until the coffin was in the ground? Because this was the moment I was most vulnerable. Because she thought grief would silence me. I felt tears threaten, but I forced them back. Not here. Not in front of investors and attorneys and extended family. My father had taught me one thing better than anyone: never negotiate from emotion. I straightened my shoulders. I see, I said quietly. Margaret seemed almost surprised that I wasn't collapsing. The service ended in a blur. People avoided my eyes. Some looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. The damage had been done. But as I stood there, staring at the polished wood of my father's coffin, one thought settled into my mind with terrifying calm. If she was lying, this wasn't cruelty. It was fraud. And fraud leaves a trail. I didn't argue with her at the funeral. I didn't cause a scene. I simply waited until the next morning and made one phone call to my father's attorney. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in my father's attorney's office, staring at the same mahogany desk I had leaned against dozens of times during estate planning meetings. His name was Thomas Hale, and he had worked with my father for over 25 years. If there was an adoption file hidden somewhere, he would know. He closed the door gently behind me and didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I'm very sorry about yesterday," he said carefully. "That was unexpected." "That's one word for it," I replied. I hadn't slept. My eyes felt dry and swollen, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Grief had burned into something focused. "Mr. Hale," I said, keeping my voice steady, "was I adopted?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a locked drawer, pulled out a thick binder labeled Bennett Estate Planning, and began flipping through tabbed sections. "I have overseen every legal adjustment your father made in the last 2 decades, he said slowly. "Trust amendments, corporate restructuring, asset protection, beneficiary updates." He looked up at me. "There has never been adoption paperwork filed through my office." My heart pounded, not with relief yet, but with rising confusion. "Could it have been done privately?" I asked. "Adoptions are court-supervised proceedings," he said. "Especially 34 years ago. There would be records, sealed, perhaps, but records." He leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "Charlotte, did you know anything about this before yesterday?" "No, not even a whisper, not even a hint." I thought about every birthday, every school event, every doctor's appointment my father attended. The way he used to tease that I had inherited his stubbornness, the identical dimple in our left cheeks. None of it felt like a lie. Thomas exhaled slowly. "There's something else you should know." My stomach tightened. "Your mother filed an emergency petition late yesterday afternoon." "For what?" "To temporarily freeze distribution of the estate and request sole administrative control, citing dispute of heirship." It was like being hit with cold water. She moved that fast? She was prepared. The word hung heavy between us. If there were truly sealed adoption documents, she would have provided certified copies to the court. Instead, she had made a public announcement, then filed to secure control before I could respond. That wasn't grief. That was strategy. "What happens now?" I asked. "The estate is temporarily frozen until heirship is legally clarified." Thomas explained, "If you are not a biological or legally adopted child, your inheritance rights could be limited depending on how the will is structured." I knew exactly how it was structured. My father had shown me drafts years ago. I wasn't just listed as a beneficiary. I was named successor-controlling shareholder of Bennett Development Group. If I was suddenly deemed not his child, that provision could be challenged. My mother wouldn't just gain money, she would gain power, and control had always mattered more to her than affection ever did. I stood and walked to the window, staring at the city skyline my father had helped shape. "There's one way to end this quickly," Thomas said quietly. I turned. "DNA testing." The word made my chest tighten. Even though I was certain, absolutely certain, a small, irrational fear crept in. What if? What if my entire identity shifted with one laboratory result? Thomas continued. Hospitals often retain preserved samples for a period of time. Additionally, your father underwent several medical procedures over the years. Tissue samples may still be archived. And if the test confirms I'm his biological child, then your mother's petition collapses. And if it doesn't, he didn't answer immediately, then we deal with that reality. I swallowed hard. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about who I was. I thought about the last conversation I had with my father, just weeks before his heart attack. He had squeezed my hand and said, "No matter what happens, you stand steady. You don't let anyone push you out of what you've built." He hadn't sounded like a man hiding a lifelong secret. He had sounded like a father proud of his daughter. I turned back to Thomas. "File the motion," I said. "Request court-ordered DNA testing." He studied my face, perhaps looking for hesitation. "There wasn't any, if your mother fabricated this," he said carefully. "It escalates beyond a family dispute." "To what?" "To attempted inheritance fraud." The word felt heavy. "Criminal?" I closed my eyes briefly. I didn't want her arrested. I didn't want a scandal. I just wanted the truth. But she had chosen the battlefield, and she had chosen it publicly. "File it," I repeated. As I walked out of his office, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "You should accept this gracefully. It will be less embarrassing for you." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed back one sentence. "See you in court." By that afternoon, the motion for DNA testing had been filed, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw something crack in her composure. Because if she were telling the truth, she would have welcomed the test. Instead, she tried to block it. My mother filed her objection within 24 hours. She claimed the request for DNA testing was invasive, disrespectful to the deceased, and emotionally motivated harassment. Her attorney argued that sealed adoption records made biological testing unnecessary, but there was one problem. She still hadn't produced certified copies of any official adoption decree, only that cream-colored folder she had waved dramatically at the funeral. The judge assigned to the estate dispute, Judge Eleanor Whitmore, was not a woman easily swayed by theatrics. During the preliminary hearing, she leaned forward, folded her hands, and asked my mother a simple question. "Counsel, if the petitioner is confident in the adoption documentation, why oppose verification?" My mother didn't look at me. She kept her gaze fixed ahead. Her lawyer spoke instead. "We believe this is an attempt to intimidate a grieving widow." Judge Whitmore's expression didn't change. "DNA testing will proceed," she ruled. "This court prefers facts over declarations." Just like that, the path was set. The testing process wasn't simple, because my father had already been buried. The court approved retrieval of preserved hospital tissue samples from a cardiac procedure he'd undergone 3 years earlier. Those samples, stored legally for medical record purposes, were admissible for comparison. I gave my own sample the next morning. The technician swabbed the inside of my cheek while I stared at the sterile white wall. It felt surreal. 34 years of life reduced to microscopic strands of genetic code. When I walked out of the clinic, reporters were already outside the building. Someone had leaked the story. Airship dispute rocks Bennett estate. Daughter challenges adoption claim. My mother moved quickly in social circles. She had always understood narrative power. If she couldn't legally secure control yet, she could shape perception. Friends stopped calling. 2 board members postponed meetings with me. I began to understand her strategy wasn't just about law. It was about isolation. If enough doubt surrounded my identity, investors might pressure for alternative leadership, for stability. That night, alone in my house, I let myself feel it. The fear, not of losing money, but of losing history. I walked into my childhood bedroom at my parents' home. The house was temporarily sealed pending estate review, but I still had access to my personal belongings. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled open an old drawer. Inside was a faded photograph, my father holding me on his shoulders at a county fair. I couldn't have been older than 5. We were both laughing. Our smiles were identical. Our eyes the same shade of hazel. I traced the photo with my finger. What if she's right? I whispered into the empty room. Not because I believed it, but because uncertainty is loud in the dark. Memories flooded back. My father defending me during an argument when I was 16 and had dented his car. My mother had been furious. He had simply laughed and said, "She gets her driving skills from me." At the time, it was a joke. Now it felt like proof. Still, doubt lingered. If the results somehow contradicted everything I believed, I would have to rebuild my identity from scratch. The waiting lasted 12 days. 12 days of silence from investors. 12 days of online speculation. 12 days of my mother attending charity luncheons looking pale and dignified, telling anyone who would listen how painful this situation was for her. On the 13th day, Thomas called. "Results are in," he said. His voice was controlled, but I heard something underneath it. Not fear, not concern, something else. "Come to the office," he added. I drove there in a haze. The city felt distant, like I was watching it through glass. When I entered his office, he was standing instead of sitting. A sealed envelope lay on his desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "This determines everything," I said quietly. "Yes," he replied. My hands were steady as I reached for the envelope. Steadier than I expected. I broke the seal. The paper inside felt impossibly thin. My eyes scanned the clinical language first. Statistical probability, marker comparison, laboratory authentication. Then the line that mattered. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. I didn't breathe. Thomas exhaled slowly, almost like he had been holding his breath with me. "You are his biological daughter," he said softly. Relief didn't come as tears. It came as fire. Not only was I his daughter. The report included an additional notation. No genetic markers indicated the presence of any other biological offspring on file within the medical database connected to prior estate screenings. I wasn't just his child. I was his only biological child. I looked up at Thomas. "She knew," I said. He nodded. "And Charlotte," he added carefully, sliding another document toward me. "Our forensic document examiner reviewed the adoption certificate your mother submitted to the court yesterday." My pulse quickened. "And? The paper stock was manufactured 2 years ago. The seal is a digital reproduction. The metadata shows the file was created 8 days before the funeral. 8 days. Before he was even buried. My mother hadn't revealed a secret. She had created one." Thomas met my eyes. "This is no longer a family dispute." "What is it?" I asked. His expression hardened. "It's attempted fraud." The courtroom was quieter than I expected. No dramatic gasps. No raised voices. Just the low hum of tension that settles in when everyone knows something irreversible is about to happen. My mother sat at the petitioner's table in a pale gray suit. Her posture flawless. Her expression carefully composed. If someone had walked in without context, they would have thought she was the victim. I sat across from her with Thomas beside me and a certified copy of the DNA results in front of us. Judge Whitmore entered, and the room rose. "Be seated." Her tone was calm, controlled. The kind of calm that doesn't need to prove authority. Thomas stood first. "Your Honor, we are submitting certified laboratory results confirming that Charlotte Bennett is the biological daughter of the decedent, Richard Bennett. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. He handed the documents to the clerk. The judge reviewed them in silence. Then she looked up. "Counsel for Mrs. Bennett, do you contest the validity of these results?" My mother's attorney shifted slightly. "We would request independent verification. The court-appointed laboratory is accredited and neutral." Judge Whitmore interrupted. "Do you have evidence of procedural error?" A pause. "No, Your Honor." The air in the room shifted. I didn't look at my mother yet. I wanted her to hear it without my reaction clouding the moment. Judge Whitmore continued. "The court therefore recognizes Charlotte Bennett as the biological child of Richard Bennett." The words settled into the room like a final stamp. It should have been enough. It wasn't. Thomas rose again. "Your Honor, There is an additional matter. We request the court's attention to Exhibit C, the alleged adoption certificate submitted by Mrs. Bennett. The document was displayed on the courtroom screen. I saw it clearly for the first time. The official-looking seal, the typed signatures, the formal language. It looked convincing, if you didn't know what to look for. Thomas spoke steadily. A forensic document examiner reviewed this file. The paper stock was manufactured in 2024. The digital seal is a reproduction. Metadata confirms the file was created 8 days prior to Mr. Bennett's death. A ripple moved through the gallery. Judge Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "Counsel," she addressed my mother's attorney. "Is your client alleging this is a legitimate court-issued document?" The attorney hesitated. "Just slightly, but enough. My client believed it to be." "Belief is not authentication," the judge replied evenly. For the first time, my mother's composure cracked. "It was real," she said suddenly, her voice tight. "Richard and we handled things privately." The judge's gaze locked onto her. "Mrs. Bennett, adoptions are not handled privately without court oversight. Fabricating a legal record and submitting it to influence estate distribution is a serious matter." The word fabricating landed heavily. I finally turned and looked at her. There was no grief in her eyes now, only calculation and something else, fear. Thomas delivered the final piece. "Your Honor, we further note that Mrs. Bennett filed an emergency petition to assume sole administrative control of the Bennett estate immediately following her public announcement at the funeral. That petition relied on the claim that my client was not a biological heir." Silence. The pattern was undeniable. Public declaration. Legal filing. Attempted consolidation of power. Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly. "This court does not tolerate attempts to manipulate heirship through fraudulent representation." My mother's attorney began speaking rapidly about emotional distress, about confusion, about misunderstanding old records. The judge raised a hand. "Enough." Her voice wasn't loud. "It didn't need to be. The DNA results are clear. The alleged adoption document lacks authenticity. This court will initiate a separate inquiry into potential fraud." My mother went still, not shocked, not devastated, just still. And for the first time since the funeral, I saw the full picture. She hadn't lashed out in grief. She had calculated timing. She had prepared documentation. She had filed motions within hours. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. It was planned erasure. Judge Whitmore continued. "Pending further review, administrative control of the Bennett estate is hereby suspended from Mrs. Bennett. The court will appoint an independent executor until the fraud inquiry concludes." The words echoed louder than anything else had that morning. Stripped of control, not temporarily frozen, suspended. My mother's attorney tried to object. "Your Honor, this is extreme." "What is extreme?" the judge replied calmly. "Is attempting to remove a lawful heir through falsified documentation." The gavel struck once, sharp, final. I felt something release inside me. Not joy, not triumph. Validation. My identity had been challenged in front of the world. And now, in that same public arena, the truth had been restored. As we stood to leave, my mother finally looked at me fully. Her eyes weren't wet. They weren't apologetic. They were assessing, as if recalculating. And I understood something chilling in that moment. She wasn't finished fighting. This wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about control. And she had just lost it in the most public way possible. But the judge wasn't done either, because the fraud inquiry would determine something even bigger than inheritance. It would determine consequences. Fraud hearings don't carry the emotional chaos of family disputes. They are colder, more surgical, and far more dangerous. 2 weeks after the DNA confirmation, we were back in court. Not to argue about heirship, but to determine whether my mother had knowingly attempted to commit estate fraud. By then, the story had spread beyond business circles. Local media framed it delicately at first. Dispute over Bennett estate intensifies. But once the forensic findings were filed publicly, the language shifted. Forgery allegations in high-profile inheritance case. The board of Bennett Development Group had already appointed interim management under the court's instruction. My mother was no longer permitted to make executive decisions, access estate accounts, or represent the company publicly. Control, the thing she had tried to secure, was already slipping through her fingers. The courtroom that morning felt heavier. No extended family this time. No curious onlookers. Just attorneys, a forensic document examiner, and a judge who did not look patient. Thomas presented first. Your Honor, Exhibit A confirms the adoption certificate submitted by Mrs. Bennett was created using modern digital formatting inconsistent with documents from 1991, the year in which she claims the adoption occurred. The forensic expert took the stand. She explained the paper composition, the ink dating analysis, the pixel layering around the court seal that revealed it had been scanned and reinserted. Clinical, precise, unemotional. Each detail stripped away another layer of plausible denial. My mother's attorney attempted to argue confusion, that perhaps she had been misled by outdated copies, that grief clouded her judgment. Then Thomas introduced the timeline. The document's metadata showed it was created 8 days before my father's death. 8 days. Before the funeral. Before any alleged shock or emotional distress. Judge Whitmore's voice cut cleanly through the courtroom. Mrs. Bennett, did you or did you not authorize the creation of this document? My mother's jaw tightened. I believed it reflected the truth. That was not my question. A pause. Yes, she said quietly. I authorized it. There it was. Not hysteria. Not confusion. Authorization. The judge folded her hands. And you presented this document publicly at the decedent's funeral and subsequently relied upon it to petition for sole administrative control of the estate? Yes. The words sounded smaller this time. The courtroom was silent. I felt no satisfaction, only a strange steadiness, because this was no longer about whether she hurt me. It was about whether she broke the law. Judge Whitmore delivered her ruling without theatrics. The court finds sufficient evidence that Mrs. Margaret Bennett knowingly submitted falsified documentation in an attempt to influence estate control and heirship determination. My mother didn't react. She simply stared forward. Given the severity of the conduct, the judge continued, Mrs. Bennett is permanently removed from administrative authority over the Bennett estate. Permanently, not suspended, removed. An independent fiduciary would oversee the estate's financial restructuring. Corporate governance would be reviewed. All prior petitions filed under the fraudulent claim were nullified. But the judge wasn't finished. This matter will be referred to the district attorney for evaluation of potential criminal charges relating to attempted fraud. The air shifted again. Criminal? Up until that moment, this had lived in the gray space between family betrayal and civil dispute. Now it crossed into something far more serious. My mother's attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, we request leniency. There was no financial transfer completed. No funds were disbursed. Intent, Judge Whitmore replied evenly, is sufficient when supported by action. The gavel struck, one decisive sound. It felt different from the previous hearing. That one had restored my identity. This one removed her power. As we exited the courtroom, reporters were waiting again. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. I kept walking. Inside the hallway, just past the security doors, I felt a presence behind me. Charlotte, her voice. I stopped, slowly turned. My mother stood a few feet away. No cameras, no attorneys, no audience. Just us. For the first time since the funeral. She looked smaller, not physically, but structurally, like something that had once towered over me had cracked at its foundation. You've made your point, she said quietly. I studied her face. No, I replied. You did. Her eyes hardened slightly. You could have handled this privately. You announced it at a funeral. Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might apologize. She didn't. Instead, she said something that made everything finally make sense. I was protecting what was mine. Mine. Not ours. Not your father's wishes. Mine. And in that single word, I understood the truth wasn't about adoption. It wasn't even about inheritance. It was about control she believed she deserved. And the moment my father trusted me with the company, she saw me as a threat. I looked at her steadily. You didn't try to protect anything, I said. You tried to erase me. She didn't deny it. She just turned and walked away. And I knew then, whatever happened next legally, the relationship we once pretended to have was over. But there was still one thing left unfinished, because I needed to understand something deeper. Why she thought she could win. 3 days after the fraud ruling, she asked to meet. Not through her attorney. Not through a formal request. She called me directly. I think we should talk, she said. Her voice was controlled again, almost steady. Privately, for a moment, I considered refusing, but I realized something. I didn't want legal closure alone. I wanted truth. We met at the house, the one now technically part of the frozen estate. The independent executor had allowed temporary supervised access for personal belongings. The living room felt unfamiliar without my father's presence. The silence there used to feel warm. Now it felt hollow. She stood by the fireplace when I walked in. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You've always been dramatic." I almost laughed. "You forged an adoption record." Her jaw tightened. "You're acting like I tried to kill someone. You tried to erase me." Silence. I stepped further into the room. "Why?" I asked plainly. "Not legally, not strategically. Why?" She turned toward the window instead of toward me. "Because he chose you." The answer was so immediate, so unfiltered, that it caught me off guard. "What does that even mean?" "It means," she said sharply, "that after 36 years of marriage, your father handed his life's work to you." There it was. Not grief, not confusion, jealousy. "He didn't hand it to me," I replied. "I worked there for 12 years. You were his daughter." "Yes, that's exactly the point." Her voice cracked for the first time. "You walked into board meetings at 22 and everyone listened because you had his last name. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't see the way he looked at you when you discussed expansion plans?" I stared at her. "He was proud of me, and he stopped trusting me," she snapped. The room went still. That was it. That was the fracture line I had never seen clearly. "He told me," she continued, quieter now, "that you understood the business better, that you had vision." She swallowed. "He said I was too cautious." I remembered those conversations. My father had struggled in the final years to modernize operations. He wanted aggressive development strategies. My mother had always favored stability. They argued about it behind closed doors. I had assumed it was normal marital disagreement. I hadn't realized it had grown into something corrosive. "So you thought," I said slowly, "that if I wasn't his biological child, the controlling shares would default to you." She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation. "You weren't protecting what was yours," I said. "You were trying to reverse his decision." "He was emotional near the end," she insisted weakly. "He wasn't thinking clearly. He amended the will 2 years ago." She looked away. And then, finally, something honest surfaced. I couldn't accept that after everything I gave up for that company, I would become secondary. Secondary to me. The word should have hurt. Instead, it clarified everything. "This wasn't about money," I said quietly. "It was about status." Her eyes met mine. "And you would have destroyed me publicly to keep it." She flinched, just slightly. "I didn't think you would fight this hard." That sentence lingered between us. She hadn't miscalculated legally. She had miscalculated me. "You thought I would collapse," I said. "You were grieving." "Yes," I replied. "And so were you." The difference was I hadn't weaponized it. The house felt colder than it ever had before. "Do you regret it?" I asked. She hesitated. "I regret that it went this far. Not regret for the lie. Not regret for the humiliation. Only regret for losing." And in that moment, something inside me settled permanently. I wasn't angry anymore. I was finished. You didn't just challenge my inheritance, I said calmly. You challenged my identity in front of the world. She had no response, because there wasn't one. I turned toward the door. Whatever happens with the district attorney, I added without looking back. That's on you. Charlotte, I paused. For a split second, I wondered if she would say something real, an apology, an admission. Instead, she said, you don't have to push for charges. There it was again. Control. Even now, I faced her one last time. I didn't push for anything, I said. You created this. And I walked out of the house knowing that whatever legal outcome followed, one truth was final. I no longer needed her acknowledgement to know who I was. But there was still one last chapter left to close, because the estate would soon be finalized. And with it, the future my father had trusted me to protect. 3 months later, the Bennett estate was finalized. The independent executor submitted the final report to the court. All assets accounted for, all fraudulent petitions voided, corporate governance restored under the structure my father had established before his death. The controlling shares of Bennett Development Group were transferred exactly as written in the will. To me, not because I fought harder, not because my mother failed, but because that was always my father's intention. The district attorney ultimately filed formal charges for attempted fraud. After negotiations, my mother accepted a plea agreement, restitution for legal costs incurred by the estate, a substantial financial penalty, and permanent disqualification from serving in any fiduciary capacity related to the company. No prison time, but no authority. And in her world, authority had always been oxygen. The board requested a formal statement once the case concluded. Investors wanted reassurance. Employees wanted stability. I stood in the same conference room where my father once led expansion briefings and looked out at a table of executives who had watched this entire scandal unfold. My father built this company on long-term trust, I said calmly. That includes trust in leadership transitions. Nothing about our strategic direction is changing. I didn't mention the funeral. I didn't mention DNA tests. I didn't mention forged documents. Because the strongest statement wasn't emotional, it was operational. We closed 2 development deals that quarter. Stability returned faster than gossip ever predicted. Control, I learned, isn't loud. It's consistent. A week after the final court order, I visited my father's grave alone. No reporters, no attorneys, no audience. Just quiet. The headstone was simple, the way he would have wanted. I traced the engraved letters of his name with my fingers, remembering how that same last name had almost been stripped from me publicly. I handled it, I said softly. The wind moved gently through the cemetery trees. For months, I had thought winning meant exposing her lie. But standing there, I understood something deeper. This wasn't about defeating my mother. It was about refusing to disappear. She had tried to reduce my existence to a document, tried to rewrite 34 years of father and daughter into a technicality. But biology confirmed what I had always known. And more importantly, my father's choices confirmed it. He hadn't left me control because of blood alone. He left it because of trust, because of competence, because I had earned it beside him. The court ruling stripped her of administrative power. But the truth did something greater. It restored my name without condition. I didn't hate her. Hate would have kept me tied to the damage. Instead, I restructured the estate with clarity. I established a governance clause requiring independent oversight for future amendments. No single individual, including me, could ever manipulate heirship or authority without board transparency. If there was one thing this ordeal taught me, it was that power without accountability invites corruption, even inside families. As I stood there, I thought back to that moment at the funeral. The wind, the coffin, her voice announcing that I wasn't his. She believed grief would weaken me. She believed humiliation would silence me. She believed doubt would fracture me. Instead, it did the opposite. It forced me to anchor myself in something no forged paper could undo. I placed a small white rose at the base of the headstone. They tried to bury me with you, I whispered. Then I straightened. But you raised me stronger than that. And as I walked away from the grave, I didn't feel like a woman who had won an inheritance battle. I felt like a daughter who had refused to be erased. She tried to take my name, my identity, and my future in one calculated move. Instead, she lost the only thing she ever truly valued: control, and I kept the one thing that mattered most: the truth.